Civil War Prisoners of War by Carol Beecham. 2021 marks the 160th anniversary of this Civil War. It remains the bloodiest conflict America has ever seen. 56,000 men died while in captivity during the Civil War. That's almost as many men that died during the whole War of Vietnam. At the beginning of the war, no one believed that it would last that long. Neither side was prepared for what was to unfold. During the Civil War, 409,000 soldiers were captured from 1861 to 1865. In the beginning, prisoners were exchanged either on the field or sent home and forbidden to take up arms until they received word they had formally been exchanged. Initially, there weren't a lot of Civil War prisons, but when the exchange system started to break down in 1863, there arose a need. The whole exchange system eventually stopped completely, which led to severe overcrowding in the prisons on both sides. By the time the war ended, there were 150 different prison compounds throughout the North and the South. The photo on the screen is a group of Civil War soldiers waiting to be exchanged. The list of the different types of prisons you see on the screen was taken from the book Portals to Hell: Military Prisons of the Civil War by Lonnie R. Spear. The North and the South began using whatever buildings they could use to house the prisoners. Many prisons were constructed out of existing factories, warehouses, and military training camps. One prison called Gratiot Street Prison in St. Louis, Missouri, was once used as a medical college. Some were made for more permanent structures like coastal fortifications, while others were simply a cluster of tents enclosed by high fences. The worst kind of prisons were the barren stockades. The stockades were cheap and used only in the South. They were constructed around a number of acres without any type of shelter on it other than what the prisoners could build for themselves. An example of this type of prison is Camp Sumter, otherwise known as Andersonville. Andersonville is considered the Civil War's most deadliest prison camp. 45,000 prisoners were received during its 14 months of existence. Out of those 45,000 prisoners, 13,000 died. Andersonville may have been the worst, but the other prisoner of war camps also had major suffering and overcrowding. This was the case on both the Confederate and Union side. Overcrowding was a huge problem for the prison system during the Civil War, as was food shortages. Without proper nutrition, the soldiers' bodies couldn't heal and diseases began to spread like wildfire. Numerous outbreaks of smallpox, rubella, and typhoid fever were rampant amongst the prisoners. Shortages of medicine, doctors, and basic hygiene meant a death sentence for many of the ill soldiers. Pneumonia was also a problem. Prisoners were often clothed in threadbare uniforms that did little to protect them against the harsh winds during the cold winter. Many were without blankets and lived in tents under these harsh conditions. Winter was especially hard on the southern prisoners from the Gulf states that were imprisoned up north. The summer months were especially cruel to the northern prisoners kept in the hot South. The prolonged heat proved to be a breeding ground for disease. Dysentery and diarrhea caused as many deaths as the absence of food. The prisoners at Andersonville made matters worse by relieving themselves in the same place where they gathered their drinking water. Hardships can bring out the worst and best in people, and nowhere is this played out more than in a prisoner of war camp. At some of the camps, prisoners would form into gangs for the purpose of preying on the weak in order to steal their food, blankets, coats, or other supplies. Fights broke out among the prisoners over the smallest offense. The harsher the conditions, the more frequent the fighting was. However, close relationships were also formed among some prisoners in their day-to-day struggle for survival. John King was a Confederate soldier imprisoned at Camp Chase, Ohio, in 1863, when a smallpox epidemic broke out among the prisoners. In 1 month, 499 men died in the outbreak. John's bunkmate came down with the dreaded disease. John took care of him and kept his illness a secret to keep him from being sent to the hospital, which was considered to be a death sentence. John kept his bunkmate covered until all the pustules had dried up. He would go to bed with him every night as though nothing was wrong. He did this knowing full well that he would come down with some form of it. John had been vaccinated, but not to all forms of it. Overcrowding was so bad that sometimes 2 to 3 men would sleep on a bunk. John did come down with it, but it was only a mild version, and his bunkmate returned the favor. It definitely helped to buddy up with someone in a Civil War prison camp. John survived being a prisoner at Camp Chase and went on to write his memoirs about his experiences there in a book called 300 Days in a Yankee Prison. It is a very detailed read of prison camp life at Camp Chase. Guards at prisons were composed mostly of young boys under 17 or older men over 45. They could also be civilians given military rank for the purpose of acting as a guard, but they knew nothing of military discipline. Oftentimes in the North, African American soldiers served as guards. There was a low tolerance by the guards for anyone not obeying the rules. At some prisons, prisoners were shot for the most trivial violation, even if the offense was unintentional. John King gave a number of examples in his book where the prisoners were badly mistreated by the guards. For example, at a certain hour at night, the guards would cry out, "Lights out." If the lights were not immediately extinguished at this time, the guard would fire into the room, regardless of who he might kill or maim. Therefore, they suffered in total darkness at night, no matter how serious the injury or illness. The same went with talking. Shots would be fired into the barracks if they spoke above a whisper. Prisoners were also shot for getting too close to the outside walls or boundaries of the prison. This was referred to as the dead line. It was definitely a line you didn't want to cross in a stockade prison. This was especially true when the prisoners outnumbered the guards, as was the case at Andersonville. At one time, there were only 2,300 guards watching over 32,000 men. There was a constant fear of a prisoner uprising. Therefore, in order to shoot without hesitation for any prisoner crossing the deadline was in place. Guards were known to take any money the prisoners had on them upon entering the prison. Any correspondence with the outside world was restricted by length and frequency. Both their outgoing and incoming mail was read by someone assigned to that duty. Any money sent in letters wasn't always credited to the prisoners. Here is an interesting Civil War tidbit that you don't hear about very often. During the Civil War, most of Abraham Lincoln's in-laws sided with the Confederacy. One of Mary Todd Lincoln's half-brothers, David Humphreys Todd, was the commander of a Confederate prison in Richmond, Virginia, named Libby Prison. David was at the infamous Libby Prison for only 2 months before Confederate President Jefferson Davis relieved him of his command. David Todd developed a reputation as a cruel and violent man in his treatment of the prisoners at Libby. He was relieved of duty after kicking a corpse out into the street and leaving it there. He also slashed a prisoner with his saber and publicly claimed that he wanted to cut out old Abe's heart. Another brother-in-law of Abe's, who became a surgeon in the Confederacy, was also known for his cruelty to Union prisoners at a Charleston hospital where he was in charge. I'm sure Mary's relatives created a lot of trouble for President Lincoln. There are many interesting articles on the internet concerning the Todds if you're interested in learning more about this divided family. Conditions were so miserable at the prison camps that some prisoners chose to escape. Those who were caught received the severest of punishments. Tunneling was the main way prisoners tried to accomplish this goal. One such attempt was made at Libby Prison in February of 1864 when 109 inmates tried to escape through a tunnel that they had dug over a few months. Imprisoned officers Colonel Thomas E. Rose and Major A. G. Hamilton were able to secretly carve out a tunnel behind the stove in the kitchen using chisels and a wooden spittoon. It measured 50 to 60 feet. At one point, it was only 16 inches wide. They were able to accomplish this by working on it through the night in the cold and dark while they fended off the rats. Out of 109 soldiers who successfully escaped, only 59 reached safety. 2 drowned crossing a river while trying to escape, and 48 were recaptured, including Colonel Rose. Another way prisoners tried to escape their confinement was to rush the gates. The prisoners would wait for the gates to open to allow the bread wagon to come in. Then they would rush the guards at the gate, who would promptly open up gunfire on the fleeing prisoners. They felt it was better to be shot down from gunfire than to slowly deteriorate from starvation and disease. After escaping from the prison, they were usually hunted down by a cavalry unit or dogs and brought back the worse for wear. Few actually made it to freedom. Some camps even had spies among them pretending to be a prisoner to try to uncover plots of escape. There were also soldiers who tattled on their fellow comrades in exchange for good food and an easier time. On a lighter note, it's amazing what men will do under their dismal circumstances for a bit of fun. John King provides us a look into how the men occupied their time while in captivity. Games of chance were very popular among the men, using whatever they had. One thing that there was plenty of was lice. Using lice, the prisoners would conduct races to bet on. The race course was on the surface of an inverted tin pan. This tin pan would be heated up just enough to get the lice moving, but not enough to kill them. The players would pick the biggest and hardiest lice from their personal stock to compete in the race. All racers were put in the center of the heated tin pan. At once the lice would scatter, trying to escape the heat. The lice would run in circles until they made it to the edge. The first one to go over the edge would be declared the winner. These races would cause great excitement amongst the prisoners. The prisoners raced for food. Losing meant that you lost a day's ration. Occasionally, the prisoners at Camp Chase would hold a prison ball if the weather was nice. A certain number of men represented the ladies by running a string through the center of their blankets and tying them around their waist. The balls would be held in the open plaza or street of the prison. Among the prisoners were some accomplished musicians and some who were very knowledgeable to the Southern dances. These balls were conducted just like regular balls. Partners would be selected for the first several dances and their names entered on slips of paper. They would have a grand march, a lively cotillion, a graceful waltz, and an old Virginia reel. It was a treat for everyone involved, including the guards, who enjoyed watching the dances and never did anything to break them up. If you're interested in looking into the prisoner of war Civil War records, Ancestry.com and FamilySearch.org have some available online. The U.S. Civil War Prisoner of War Records 1861 to 1865 database is available on Ancestry and is comprised of the 4 National Archives microfilm series that are shown on the screen. The records will vary for each individual depending on the record types and forms. All the names have been indexed and are searchable in this database. We also have the National Archives M598 series available on microfilm in our Genealogy Department at George Memorial Library in Richmond. These records were created by the Union military prisons. The M598 series includes all of the major prisons that operated in the North during the war, such as Camp Chase, Johnson's Island, Point Lookout, Camp Morton, Fort Delaware, and Elmira. It also includes the lesser-known camps that were located in some southern cities, such as Knoxville, Little Rock, Memphis, and New Orleans. Each camp produced a variety of records about the prisoners, including general ledgers, death registers, and descriptive lists. This is an example of an entry I got off of Ancestry's database, U.S. Civil War Prisoner of War Records 1861 to 1865. The headings across the top are name, rank, regiment or county and state, company, where captured, when captured, sent for exchange, when and where exchanged, and remarks. Under the remarks section, they mostly gave the name of the prison of where they were transferred to, but there are a few comments like spy and bushwhacker that I found interesting. The remarks section may also give the date of death. To find out more information, go to FamilySearch.org. They have the U.S. records of Confederate prisoners of war 1861 to 1865, but in the Browse option only. They also have very informative wiki pages on both Union and Confederate prisoner of war records. There seems to be more records pertaining to prisoners of war on the Confederate side rather than the Union side. I don't think the Confederacy was as good about keeping records as the Union Army was. The Soldiers and Sailors System database has a list of prisoners from 2 Civil War prisons, which are Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Maryland, and Andersonville in Georgia. Fort McHenry had 15,000 Confederate soldiers, and Andersonville had more than 45,000 Union soldiers confined there. The example on the screen was taken from their website. An index for this website is available on Ancestry.com. Fort McHenry served as a Union transfer prison camp for Confederate prisoners of war and Southern sympathizers. As with all Civil War prison camps, life was hard at Fort McHenry. Each prisoner received 1 blanket and a tin cup, but no other comforts, including bedding, chairs, stools, wash basins, and eating utensils. They whittled their forks and spoons from wood. Their meals consisted mostly of hardtack, which was sometimes moldy. To verify that your ancestor was a prisoner of war, refer to compiled military service records and pensions. These documents will usually note captivity in a prison, but you might also find mention of captivity in letters, diaries, memoirs, and other secondary sources in the absence of military service records. The example on the screen is that of a compiled military service record for Lieutenant John M. Hensley. The card on the right is a prisoner of war roll card that tells when and where he was captured and the name of the prison he is being held in. The card on the left states that he was at Gratiot Street Prison Hospital in St. Louis, Missouri in April of 1864, where he died of laryngitis on April 9th. There are over 24 historic Civil War prison sites that you can visit, which are managed by federal, state, and private organizations. A few of these sites are featured on the National Parks website. For more information about Civil War prisons, visit the American Battlefield Trust website. This site has a lot to offer on the topic of the Civil War. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for watching.